Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration. I think you could take this back to Thomas Jefferson. If this happened in 1801, there is simply no way that they would allow a foreign great power to come bring our neighbor, overthrow their government, and then bring our neighbor into their military alliance. I think there's no great power that would ever tolerate that.
So recently, Dave Smith went on Lex Fridman's podcast to talk about multiple subjects, among them Ukraine, and that's a subject that this channel's followed really closely. Dave has some unique insights into this and really understands the history of the conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and more or less the United States and Russia, more than just about anyone else out there. So let's watch and let's react.
Can we take that idea and move to the war in Ukraine?
Sure.
What do you think is the path for peace there?
Well, I think what Trump is pursuing is like infinitely preferable to what Biden was doing. You know, what puts Donald Trump, and I don't think everything he's done has been perfect, and I really did not like that mineral deal that he was floating out for a while there. And I think maybe that might be the best thing that came out of that Oval Office thing, is that maybe that, you know, Donald Trump goes, it's going to be very tough to do business like this. And it's like, yeah, we shouldn't be doing this business deal anyway. But, and by the way, I don't think we should do it on a few number one, principally, I think it is kind of like bullying Ukraine out of resources. And from what I understand, they don't even have that many like fine minerals, but whatever. But it's also like, well, look, if he was selling it to Zelensky, that's kind of a security guarantee. You know, because like, hey, if we're in business, then if Putin messes with you, he's messing with us. But from my perspective, like, that's the whole point, is you don't want to get into the business of giving out security guarantees. I mean, this is why George Washington was against entangling alliances. Like, you give out war guarantees to too many places, you might have to fight a lot more wars than you otherwise would have fought. And also, like, we're in this weird position where America postures like they're so tough, but really when it comes down to it, we're not going to war in Ukraine. There's no political will here. Like, I'm sorry, you try to convince the American people we should send our boys to get, like, I understand you're from the region, but like for you, or you have roots from there, but like to the average American, the idea of going to war over whether Luhansk is ruled by Kiev or Moscow is just, they don't even know what Luhansk is. And if they met someone from there, would probably just assume they were Russian. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, this is so true. The whole mineral deal was a facade, it seemed, to justify the continuance of support to Ukraine. And I think it was a preposterous idea. Of course, that's still happening anyways because Trump resumed support to Ukraine. I think Dave's being a little bit charitable here to Trump, actually. I do still prefer Trump's approach to Ukraine more than Biden's, but that's not exactly a great consolation. But still, you know, there's a long road to go until there's peace. It's good that diplomatic relations have been open with Russia and Lavrov to discuss the potential for peace, but I haven't seen much headway there. And in fact, we pretty much still have status quo. Dave Smith's totally right here, though, in terms of entangling alliances and how they're so destructive.
And they might be, but whatever. I think the first step to a path to peace is that you have to want to get a path to peace. So I think Trump's doing a good job in that.
Do you think all three sides want peace, from what you understand? Obviously, Trump legitimately, fully, with an urgency, wants peace.
I think for sure Trump wants peace. I also think Putin wants to wrap the conflict up. And I think that Putin has been willing to deal for the entire lead up to the war and pretty much throughout the war. And there's been a lot of solid reporting on this. And I mean, the sources on it are pretty impeccable. The head of NATO, Stoltenberg, I always mess up his name, but he literally said that in late 2021, that Vladimir Putin actually sent a draft agreement to NATO, and that his condition for not invading is like, I will not invade, but you have to put it in writing. Like, he sent a draft treaty to them. You have to put in writing that Ukraine will not join NATO. And
you can find this video of Stoltenberg doing this, by the way. It's out there online and easily accessible. And what's so crazy about this, too, is he boasted about the fact that he rejected Putin's idea, you know, to try to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO so he wouldn't invade. Stoltenberg basically laughed about it and said, instead, Putin got exactly the opposite of what he wanted, you know? So, and it's true. I mean, Ukraine's been treated as a de facto NATO power for the most part, in terms of military supplies, military equipment, military support. Of course, we don't have huge amounts of U.S. forces on the ground. We did have some special forces on the ground, which was revealed by the Discord leaker. But we don't want a hot war. Dave's right about that. And even the head of NATO said things that us anti-war dissidents are called conspiracy theorists for noting. Like, this is what Putin wanted. The draft treaty script is still out there, too. You can read this entire transcript. That's exactly what it called for.
And then Stoltenberg bragged about how he said, no, because we won't let Vladimir Putin dictate to us whether we can expand NATO or not. And then he was bragging. He was like, and look what he got. More NATO expansion, Finland and this and that. So look at that. It didn't even seem to notice, like, that, wait a minute, you're admitting that you could have just promised not to bring Ukraine into NATO and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Seems like it would have been a much better deal. It's going to be a much better deal than what Ukraine will ultimately end up getting. So I think also the Joe Biden's CIA director, who was a CIA director his whole 4 years, William Burns, when he was ambassador to Russia, he wrote the "Niet means Niet." And in the memo, and again, this was dumped by Julian Assange, this wasn't for the public. This was just him writing to Condoleezza Rice to tell the Secretary of State his assessment. And he said that his exact words were, a decision Russia does not want to have to make. And this was the decision about whether to invade Ukraine or not. And he was like, they say, if you keep pushing for Ukrainian entry into NATO, this could lead to a civil war, and even worse. And in that situation, Russia would have to decide whether or not to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to make. So essentially, it's like, I think it's pretty clear from all sides that Putin didn't want it to come to this. And look, I mean, even after the coup in 2014, he took Crimea, but he didn't invade the country. I mean, he may have sent special forces in, but I mean, not the full-scale 2022 invasion. And even for the Civil War, going all that, he did, it seemed like I'm not defending the decision. I'm just saying it seemed like he reluctantly debate. What was it, in 2014 or 15, when they had the plebiscites in Crimea and in the Donbass region, and they voted to be independent? He didn't take them then. I mean, he could have used that as a pretense for, like, hey, they voted to be with us, and he didn't. I think he wants to end the war. Zelensky, from everything he's said publicly, seems like he still feels like, I mean, I'm just taking him at his word here, that it's like, well, no, look, like, we could end the war, but we got to end the war. It seems like he's moved from his position being like, no, we have to reclaim all of our territory, to now his position is kind of like, all right, maybe we don't reclaim all of it, but we got to be given some type of security guarantee in the future.
Yeah, and that's what the U.S. can't endure, because it would call for ground forces the same way that Article 5 of the NATO treaty calls for the member states to, send offensive military units to theaters of war when those countries are invaded. Dave's right about Putin. Say whatever you want about him. He didn't want war with Ukraine. He did invade, of course, but that was like 8 years into the civil war between the Donbass region and Ukraine, after these plebiscites were happening, and after the U.S. partook in the overthrow of the Yanukovych government in 2014, which, of course, is totally ignored by the mainstream media. Now, it was the NATO position and essentially the U.S. neocon position, even going back to the Clinton administration, actually, when, neocons weren't quite in power yet, but some of their ideas were influential, to include Ukraine in NATO. George Bush called for it at the end of his presidency, and those calls were repeated over and over. Meanwhile, there was 4 waves of NATO expansion, I think 5 now with Finland and the others that have happened. So all this time, the Niet means Niet memo was confirming that's the red line, but the US and NATO were still pushing toward that.
I think the problem with that is just, again, like, I don't mean to be cruel about this, because, like, it sucks that there's little countries that are next to big countries that kind of get bullied around about them, but there also is a bit of an entitlement to demanding a security guarantee. Like, what exactly do you mean? From America? What, that we'll go to war if you're invaded? Why do we owe that to anybody? Like, that's crazy. I'm sorry. You can just sign up to say that we'll go to war if anybody invades anybody. I mean,
especially if it's against a nuclear power. That puts it on a completely different level, putting your forces in harm's way when the employment of nuclear weapons could happen. That's just totally insane. And Russia, one of the biggest powers in the world, going to war against Russia or nuclear China would be absolutely disastrous. We can't be offering security guarantees to all these countries that, are opposed to either China or Russia in particular, but also to other nuclear powers.
I hope nobody invades anybody, but I don't want us to get dragged into that. That's a recipe for always being at war, and I don't think that's right for our country.
And the U.S. hasn't learned that lesson, especially in the last century. Entangling alliances are the status quo. It's the way of Washington.
So essentially, I think Trump and Putin want peace. And if that's the case, I think we'll ultimately get to an end of this war.
So there's a lot of stuff to say here. Let's actually start at the beginning, at the foundation of this. I think the thing that we left unsaid that's important to say is that Putin invaded Ukraine in February 24th, 2022. And I think he is, at least from my perspective, the person who started the war. You could talk about NATO expansion. You could talk about any other thing that led to it. You could start at the collapse of the Soviet Union. You can go all the way back as he did, 1,000 years. The reality is, and this goes to our deep discussion about the morality of war, no matter the reasons, the guy that pulls the trigger first, non-accidentally, and keeps pulling the trigger, that's the guy who's at fault.
No, this is just such skewed logic. And that's the same logic, by the way, that Zionists have to support Israel in all regards because of only what's happened since October 7th. They never want to go back to the past and see what led to these catastrophes. And the war was taking place before Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Like I said earlier, the Donbass and Ukraine were fighting it out. Ukraine shelled villages in the Donbass that wanted to be more culturally autonomous, or at least closer culturally to Russia, have a little bit more autonomy. But, somehow that's just completely lost. And yeah, NATO expansion matters because that would be like Russia involving, Mexico in its own military alliance, then putting dual purpose rockets on its border. We saw what the U.S. did during the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s. The U.S. would not let this happen. So this is just crazy. Lex is off on this one, and I know he empathizes with Ukraine. He supports Ukraine, but you can't just take one arbitrary moment and say, that person's completely at fault for everything. And that's essentially what he's doing. He's like, he's acknowledging you can go back to other places, but he just doesn't seem to grasp how Putin isn't totally culpable for this. It is the West, and it is NATO. It is the U.S. military-industrial complex. It is the people that violated what Burns was reporting in the Niet Means Niet memo. We know that this was their red line, but the U.S. didn't care.
Oh, I agree. I'll say one standard. One standard for everybody. The standard that I laid out before is the same one I said. It's like, did you absolutely have to do that? Once you start killing people by the hundreds of thousands, it's like, was there any other option? Are you telling me you absolutely had to do this? And I don't think that's right. My friend Scott Horton, who I was talking to you about, who just totally brilliant guy, even in his book, there's a whole chapter of all the other options of what Vladimir Putin could do. So you're absolutely right. And there's a weird thing where people say, if you say that the West provoked this conflict, that is a very different thing than saying that this invasion was justified. And
exactly. And that's my position. I don't think that Putin was justified, but there's reasons behind his invasion. In the same way that I don't think the 9/11 attacks were justified, but there are reasons behind how those attacks were provoked. And Ron Paul was right about that. Our forces were in the Middle East. That was one of bin Laden's chief qualms, is that we supported Israel. We starved the people of Iraq, and we occupied the Arabian Peninsula. So these consequences lead to treacherous attacks that aren't justified. But at the same time, we should look back at those incidents and see how we can avoid them in the future. That's real statesmanship. It isn't rattling sabers with nuclear powers like the U.S. is doing right now.
In the same way that, if you if you were at a bar and someone goes and spits in another guy's face and then he pulls out a gun and murders them right there, like, he's not justified in doing that. That is not okay. You don't get to murder someone because they spit in your face. Also, if you were talking about, like, why did he murder that guy, I'd be like, oh, because he walked up and spit in his face. That's why it happened. And that is essentially my contention about this war. And it is, I think it's just crystal clear that that's why it happened. Listen, it may be right or it may be wrong. But if China or Russia ever, like, backed a street putsch to overthrow the democratically elected government in Mexico and then install a pro-Chinese or a pro-Russian government and then started pumping arms into that conflict and then kept floating out the idea that they were going to bring them into their military alliance, DC would simply not allow that. You cannot do that.
Exactly.
Any more than the Soviet Union could put nukes in Cuba. Like, sorry.
That should be said that's really Cold War 20th century neocon thinking, right? It is the way the world works, but like that's
I don't think
you should still punish.
I don't think outside of the neoconservatives, listen, whether you're talking about the neoconservatives or going way before any other group that has ever had control of U.S. foreign policy, going back to the Cold Warriors, the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration. I think you could take this back to Thomas Jefferson. If this happened in 1801, there is simply no way that they would allow a foreign great power to come bring our neighbor, overthrow their government, and then bring our neighbor into their military alliance. I think there's no great power that would ever tolerate that.
That's really true, and he references the Jefferson administration. In the first Jefferson administration, Jefferson wouldn't tolerate the attacks on American shipments that went overseas, and, you know, American vessels were being attacked by the Barbary pirates, you know, kind of a loose-knit group of pirates that basically raided American cargo, sometimes enslaved their inhabitants. And, you know, he was willing to go to Congress and get a congressional act to be able to use military force to defend those ships. Not to go further than that. In fact, a lot of people at the time did want him to go further than that. A commander named William Eaton wanted him to support a regime change operation that replaced the Shah of Tripoli with his brother. Jefferson rebuked that, but he did ask Congress for that authority. This is not a neocon, that's basic defense. You go before that, the quasi-war with France. Adams, you know, basically defended or tried to defend to the best of his ability with a very small navy at the time. I think there was only 6 ships, you know, from being attacked by the French. So yeah, we would not tolerate this even on the high seas if there was, you know, threats to American security, let alone what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis before the neocons even really existed. We know the truth about how the U.S. would handle it.
First of all, we're in a post-nuclear world, right? So, meaning there's nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So the threat of somebody being on your border is just not the same kind of threat when you're a nuclear power, which is why, you know, you look at Finland.
No, I think in some ways it's more of a threat in some ways.
Well, Putin is not upset about Finland joining NATO nearly as much.
Look, I'm just saying, to Vladimir Putin, in his own words, what his issue always was the military hardware that comes along with NATO membership. So it's not just that you get into NATO, but then you get all that military hardware there. And he made a huge deal about the dual-use rocket launchers in Poland, which George W. Bush put there after 9/11. So I think all of those things are factors. I think Ukraine, the Crimea being their only year-long warm water port, I think there's like several, you know, like elements to it. But I do think a huge part of it is that the country's been invaded through Ukraine multiple times. And so there's
by Hitler and Napoleon, and I think there were other cases where that happened too, by the way.
Just, yeah, he, I think, very reasonably, within the grading on a curve of how reasonable governments are, he saw that as a security threat.
But we should make very clear, because the way that comes across, the full responsibility of the invasion of Ukraine lays at the hands of Vladimir Putin.
Sure.
I don't even agree with this. If Dave's going to agree with this, I don't fully agree with this, because, you know, there were things that preempted it that provoked him into it. I'm not saying he's not culpable or bears the lion's share of culpability for that, But a lot happened where he thought that he was boxed into a corner and that was his only choice. Again, not to justify it. I want the U.S. just out of this completely. And it shouldn't even be a question of whether Americans weigh in on, how right Putin was or how right Zelensky was. We should just get out of it.
I completely agree with that. Vladimir Putin launched a war where, again, I don't know exactly what the numbers are. I've read a whole bunch of estimates, some that contradict each other, but the consensus seems to be it's at least in the hundreds of thousands, possibly well north of 1 million, if you're talking about the casualties on both sides. And Vladimir Putin launched a war that led to that. And he's responsible for that. That being said, you can also point out that really what we're talking about here is the George H.W. Bush administration, the Clintons, Bush again, Obama, and then Trump, and the people who were in charge of the foreign policy in those administrations, the same ones who gave us Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen, they were also in charge of our European foreign policy, and they had the most reckless the most reckless policy of all was their NATO policy, and that they drove up to this conflict with Russia with nothing but off-ramp after off-ramp after off-ramp, and consciously decided that we're not going to take any of those. We're going to drive it all the way up to this point. And Thomas Friedman for the New York Times interviewed George Kennan in 1998, and this is George Kennan was the Cold Warrior. He's credited as founding the containment strategy in the Cold War. And he was talking about the first round of NATO expansion, which he and many other foreign policy graybeards opposed. And he was like, this is the worst thing we could possibly do after the fall of the Soviet Union, to now say that we had this alliance in NATO that was an anti-Russian military alliance. And now that the Soviet Union isn't there anymore, and it's Boris Yeltsin's Russia, that now we're going to expand NATO because of that. And he literally said in 1998, he goes, the people advocating that we expand NATO are going to continue advocating it and advocating it and advocating it. And then there will be a Russian reaction. And then they'll say, see, that's why we were right to expand NATO. But they'll get this completely wrong.
That is so true. And it's just haunting to read this article now today with the hindsight of the last few years. I really recommend anyone watching this do that. That Kennan article, it just prophesies the future in so many ways. And his rage just leaps out of the page, as Dave kind of put it, I think, in a different interview, because at the end statement, he essentially says, what are you guys thinking? You're throwing my life away. You're throwing my life's work away. The people that worked to end the Cold War through negotiations and not rattling of sabers and military, expeditions and proxy wars against the Soviet Union, there were so many missteps during the Cold War when it came to Korea and Vietnam and all sorts of policies. But this really was heroic in so many regards. And Kennan was one of the coldest of the Cold Warriors. But there was others like him that were mainstream diplomats, mainstream statesmen at the time that thought that NATO expansion was a total disaster. Again, totally ignored. It's never brought up by the corporate media. But I'm so thankful for people like Dave that point this out.
When do you think a deal is reached?
I really have no idea what the timeline is going to look like. I'm hoping sooner rather than later. I think Donald Trump would love nothing more than to have some type of big spectacle of ending this war, some type of big press conference or some type of, you know what I mean? And so I'm sure my guess would be that's where Trump's mind is how to do this in the best way that sells him the best. But I think that already we're in a position where Donald Trump has put a lot of political capital chips into the middle of the table that I can end this war, and he's going to look very, very bad if he can't. So he's very highly incentivized to get this thing done as quick as possible. And so hopefully that can happen soon.
I think the problem with this and Trump's approach is that Trump values his ego a little bit more than the best results for America here. He wants the credit of solving this war peacefully, diplomatically, doing whatever he can, the art of the deal, to create a lasting peace. That would probably be the best aspect of his legacy if he makes it happen. But in the process, he wants to use funding of Ukraine as an excuse to continue negotiations with that as an endpoint. Whereas my view is that you withdraw all U.S. support from Ukraine. You don't even have to be a peacemaker. You should just get the U.S. disengaged and disinvolved in this whole catastrophe. That would be better for Americans than, a potential lingering, hypothetical 6-month period where people continue to die in the fields for fruitless gains where not much territorial changes have even occurred in the last few years. So I think that's the big problem we're dealing with here. I hope I'm wrong, and I hope Trump is just willing to disengage. But I really think the reason that aid continues to flow in Ukraine is because Trump wants to negotiate a deal first. And I don't think that's possible. I think that's in the wrong order because Russia views the U.S. as a belligerent. Because we're still aiding Ukraine, they don't view us as an intermediary. And they're not going to agree to terms with a power necessarily that's shelling their forces, even though they're the invader.
It would be great if it could happen in the next month.
Yeah, people on both sides outside of Donald Trump were telling me that it's a process.
Yeah,
there's a kind of implication that's gonna take a while, which I really hate. I really love Donald Trump's urgency.
Well, it's also terrible. There's something really awful, like look, when innocent people dying in war at any time is terrible, but there is something profoundly awful. And I'm old enough now that I've seen this a few times happen, or I've lived through it a few times. I've read about it happening earlier, but it's like once you've kind of already decided the war's over and people still die, you know what I mean? There's something almost like sadder about that because it's always like, come on, you already know, like when there'd be like a big, there'd be like a bombing campaign in Afghanistan, like when we already knew we were a few months away from ending the war. You're like, oh, you got to kill more people like on the way out. We already know we're leaving. We already know that because there's something, at least in the beginning, they could kind of hide behind this justification, or they could be like, listen, we're going to overthrow the Taliban and we're going to install our new government. They're going to be a democracy. It's going really good. We have to do this in order to do this bigger project. But then by the end, you're like, we're not even pretending anymore that we're doing anything more positive. It's just someone dying in a senseless thing we never should have been in.
This is so true, and it's taken place so many times through history, especially in times where communications traveled a lot slower. One example that just crosses my mind immediately is the War of 1812, where some of the battles in that war, in fact, one of the most prestigious, biggest battles in that war, the Battle of New Orleans, took place after the Treaty of Ghent was signed, but before it was ratified by the Senate. So there's essentially a war and people dying when there was going to be a peace settlement coming. And that's just so heartbreaking in so many ways. And, to the extent that that happens and anyone gets caught up in it, it makes the horrors of war that much more real.
Well, in the spirit of that, that's why I traveled to Moscow, and we'll travel to Moscow again in the near future to likely interview Vladimir Putin and hopefully travel back to Ukraine, which I did, to talk again with Volodymyr Zelensky or with whoever the future president is.
You'll be the only guy who's interviewed both of them, I think.
Yeah.
During this war, right?
And I have to say, the border crossing is getting increasingly more intense. Like,
yeah, I went to Canada last week and I didn't care for that, so I'm sure.
Primarily, it's the nations of war, as it was in Ukraine, and it's dangerous to do both.
It's also like I think something that's a little bit foreign, no pun intended, to America is, like we've fought in a lot of wars over the last, say, 25 years, 50 years, whatever. But all of them, including in a way the world wars even in the 20th century, but it's been since 1812 that we fought one on our shores. And none of the other ones, I mean, I guess Pearl Harbor, but even
there's the Mexican-American War as well that he's forgetting, but his point still stands. It has been so many years removed, over a century since Americans fought a war on our shores. So some Americans just have, wars in the back of their mind. Oh, it's going to happen anyways. It doesn't really have tangible ramifications, but it always does, especially economically and in terms of civil liberties. We've seen that with the Patriot Act and the DHS and all that crap. So his point stands, but we did have the Mexican-American War.
Pearl Harbor, that was a one-off, and it was only...
And Spanish-American War, I think some U.S. territory was involved there too. Anyways, let's continue.
it was America technically, but it wasn't mainland America, and so we're fighting wars like halfway across the world. But it's a very different thing for two neighboring countries to fight. And even though most of the fighting's been done on the Ukrainian side, not all of it. Like there have been, I think there still are areas in Russia, like inside Russia's borders, where there's action. And so it's just like there's something so much more real about that. That's not just like, the wars we're used to are we send a military that is 100,000 times more sophisticated than anything it'll be meeting on the ground over to a third world country to go do that. Now, as we've found out over the years, there's still a lot of challenges to that. Even when your side has night vision goggles and the other one doesn't, and your side can call in airstrikes and the other one can't, and your side has all this sophisticated training and the other side's practicing on monkey bars, still very hard to occupy a people and dominate them and defeat an insurgency.
Both the US and the Soviet Union found that in particular when it came to Afghanistan. We had a 20-year war there. I think the Soviet Union had a 10-year war there where they couldn't completely conquer the territory. You can say that the US conquered the territory, but what do we have now? Well, we spent billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of lives in the end to replace the Taliban with the Taliban. The same thing essentially happened with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. They made inroads. They did invade a lot of territory, but it was rolled back.
But that's very different than like two nation states on right next to each other on the border. Like there's just a real feeling of like survival in that moment. And I do think that probably I don't understand this as well as you do, and probably you don't even understand it as well as maybe like an older generation of Russians and Ukrainians would. But like there's also something about like both Russia and Ukraine in their own ways got so absolutely fucked over in the 20th century multiple times in a way that Americans it is just too foreign to us to even.
The Holodomor comes to mind, where Stalin launched a rigid campaign to starve the Ukraine at the time, to gather up all this grain, and then all the propaganda came in and said, oh, those people are hoarding all the grain, as an impetus to take it from them, try to feed starving people in the rest of the Soviet Union that were horrifically treated because of their obscure and insane economic theories. So, that's just one case, but Dave's totally right.
Understand anything like that, like millions of people starving to death, being invaded, the entire nation collapsing. I mean, the Russian government collapsed twice in 100 years, right? That's pretty that's traumatic.
I'm gonna be that guy and say 3 times, because there was 2 revolutions in 1917: the February Revolution that overthrew Kerensky's government, and then the October Revolution that planted the Bolsheviks in power. But his point stands. A lot of people kind of consider that the same sort of conflict, but there were 3 technically. But Dave's right. This changes a lot, and people are thrown into it. Average people that, this isn't really their fight. It's a fight amongst military powers or aristocrats or revolutionaries, and they suffer. It's always innocent people that suffer because of war.
And we just simply have never been through anything like that. And so when you have that kind of like trauma as a society, and then there's a war on your border, I'm sure there's a whole lot of different kind of feelings that we just can't relate to.
Yeah, Dave's so right here. I think he has the totally correct mind frame when it comes to Ukraine and the anti-war dissident view on Ukraine. It's time to just get U.S. forces out of there. Like I said earlier, there's just been so few territorial changes. What's really to gain? And Zelensky could have had such a better deal had he agreed to a peace in Istanbul that by some accounts he was ready to sign, but Boris Johnson flew in there, and probably some influence from the State Department convinced him not to sign that agreement. Again, by some accounts, there were bottles of champagne ready to be popped in celebration of a peace between Ukraine and Russia. And had he accepted those terms, he almost certainly would have lost way less territory than he'll be losing now. I think Zelensky's in a tricky place where actually he distrusts right-wing factions within his country that would want his head on a silver platter if he agreed to peace, more than he fears Putin himself and the invading Russia force. He's going to be in a lot of political pressure if he is the one that leaves power in Ukraine in a worse position by far than Ukraine could have been in had he agreed to that peace. That's where we're at. I think a peace is dependent on withdrawing U.S. forces and resources from Ukraine. Otherwise, Russia views us as a belligerent, like I said before, and we'll never be able to be an intermediary in the way in which we could resolve a peace there otherwise. They'll be forced to sign a peace. The Europeans will have to be involved, and they will have to sign a peace with Russia. The U.S. doesn't have to be involved, but I think Trump really wants to be to put that on his legacy. But let me know what you think in the comments. Do you see a peace in Ukraine coming soon? And until I talk to you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll see you in the next one.